Donald Trump sat in his office at Trump Tower, his face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens displaying banking statistics. But one number made him pause. Over 60% of elderly Americans struggled with basic banking services. The report on his desk told a stark story. Long wait times, complicated procedures, and an increasingly digital system that left seniors behind. Do comment from where you are enjoying the story. Numbers don't tell the whole story, he said to his advisors, setting down a particularly troubling report about an elderly man who had lost his life savings due to banking complications. We need to see it firsthand, not as executives, not as politicians, but as the people who struggle with this system every day. His team exchanged concerned glances as he outlined his plan. Trump would go undercover as an elderly man trying to navigate the banking system. No security detail, no special treatment, just raw experience of what millions of Americans faced daily. "Sir, this is unprecedented," his chief advisor protested. "A former president putting himself in such a vulnerable position." Trump's expression remained resolute. "Sometimes, to fix a broken system, you need to experience it yourself." 24 hours later, Trump vanished from public view. In his place, a man in his mid-70s emerged from a modest apartment in Queens. Professional makeup artists had worked for hours, adding decades of weathering to his face. His signature hair was now gray and thinning, his designer suits replaced with clean but worn clothing. Even his distinctive way of speaking had been carefully modified through hours of practice. His destination, First Capital Bank in downtown Manhattan, where an incident the previous week had caught his attention. A 70-year-old widower had spent 6 hours trying to access his late wife's account, despite having all the necessary documentation. The man had left in tears, his dignity stripped away by a system that seemed designed to defeat him. As Trump approached the bank's towering glass entrance, he felt a weight he hadn't expected, the invisible burden carried by countless elderly Americans who faced this challenge daily. But what he didn't know was that his simple fact-finding mission was about to uncover something far more significant, a systemic failure that would lead to one of the most sweeping banking reforms in modern history. Inside, the bank buzzed with morning activity. Young professionals tapped away at their phones while making deposits, while an elderly woman struggled to read the tiny print on a form. At the far counter, a man about Trump's disguised age stood trembling, his weathered hands clutching a stack of documents. It was Howard Mitchell, the widower from last week's incident, back for another attempt. What happened next would not only change Howard's life but would spark a revolution in American banking. And it all began with a simple act of kindness that no one saw coming. Trump watched as Howard Mitchell shifted from foot to foot, exhaustion evident in his stooped shoulders. The documents in his hands, birth certificates, death certificates, marriage licenses, bank statements, represented a lifetime with his late wife, Sarah. Now they felt like pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Next," called the teller, her voice sharp and efficient. Howard shuffled forward, his hands trembling as he laid out the documents. "I'm here about my wife's account," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying for weeks." "Sir, we've been through this," the teller cut him off not unkindly but with clear impatience. "Without the original signature card from 1975, we can't verify your joint account status." Trump edged closer, pretending to fill out a deposit slip. His trained eye caught the details others might miss. How Howard's fingers curled protectively around his wife's old checkbook. How his eyes squinted at forms designed for younger eyes. How his voice quavered when explaining his situation yet again. "But the bank burned in '78, Howard explained, desperation creeping into his voice. "All the original documents were lost. I've brought everything else." The teller glanced at her supervisor, who was already shaking her head. "I'm sorry, sir. It's policy." A policy, Trump noted, that failed to account for real-world circumstances. He watched as Howard's shoulders slumped further, defeat written in every line of his face. Behind Howard, other customers began to shift impatiently. A young man in an expensive suit checked his watch repeatedly. A woman sighed loudly, typing furiously on her phone. The weight of their judgment seemed to press Howard smaller and smaller. Maybe if I could speak to someone else. Howard tried again, his voice cracking. My Sarah, she always handled the banking. I need to access our savings. The medical bills. The supervisor stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. Sir, if you can't provide the required documentation, there's nothing we can do. Perhaps you should come back when you have all the necessary paperwork. Trump felt his chest tighten. He recognized the look in Howard's eyes, the same look he'd seen in his own father's eyes years ago when age began to rob him of his independence. It was a look of shame, of frustration, of a proud man facing a world that no longer seemed built for him. Howard's hands shook as he tried to gather his documents, papers slipping from his grasp and floating to the floor. As he bent to retrieve them, his knee buckled slightly. Without thinking, Trump stepped forward to help. Thank you, Howard murmured, his eyes downcast. I just don't know what to do anymore. Sarah would have known. Trump stood slowly, documents in hand, studying the forms through his disguise. Everything was there. Decades of joint tax returns, utility bills, even love letters they'd written during Howard's service in Vietnam. Everything except one piece of paper destroyed in a fire nearly half a century ago. What happened next would not only change Howard's life, but would expose a critical flaw in America's banking system, one that affected millions of elderly citizens across the country. As Trump handed the papers back to Howard, he made a decision that would set in motion events far beyond this single bank branch. But first, he had to understand exactly how deep this problem went, and what happened next would shock everyone in the bank to their core. Sir, Trump said softly to Howard, his practiced voice masking his natural tone, would you mind if I sat with you for a moment? He gestured to the small waiting area near the deposit slips. Howard hesitated, then nodded, grateful for any kindness in this moment of despair. As they settled into the chairs, Trump noticed how the security guard's hand instinctively moved to his belt. Two elderly men in worn clothing apparently warranted extra attention. My wife, Howard began, his voice steadying slightly as he pulled out a worn photograph. We were married 52 years. She handled everything, the bills, the banking, all of it. I never worried because Sarah. His voice caught. Sarah always knew what to do. Trump listened, his trained businessman's mind cataloging every flaw in the system even as his heart responded to Howard's pain. Around them, the bank continued its mechanical routine, the click of computer keys, the whir of counting machines, the muffled conversations about mortgages and loans. The medical bills started coming after her stroke, Howard continued. I didn't even know we had a separate savings account until the hospital asked about payment arrangements. Now I can't access it because of some paper from before disco was popular. A young bank employee walked past, pausing briefly before looking away. Trump caught the flicker of sympathy in her eyes, quickly suppressed by professional detachment. Her name tag read Jessica Martinez. Trump turned back to Howard. Would you mind showing me the paperwork they're asking for? As Howard spread out the documents on the small table between them, Trump noticed Jessica glancing their way again, her expression troubled. What happened next would prove that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of defiance. Mr. Mitchell, Jessica's voice was quiet as she approached their seats. I couldn't help overhearing. I think I might know something that could help. She glanced nervously at her supervisor's office before continuing. My grandmother went through something similar last year. Trump watched as Jessica knelt beside them, her voice dropping further. There's actually a provision in the banking code, Section 4.18.3, for cases where original documentation was lost due to natural disasters or fires. Most tellers don't know about it because it's buried in the old regulations, but... Howard's eyes lit up with the first spark of hope Trump had seen. But before Jessica could continue, her supervisor's voice cut through the moment. "Jessica, a word, please." As Jessica hurried away, Trump saw something that made his blood boil. The supervisor's dismissive head shake, the stern, whispered reprimand, the way Jessica's shoulders slumped as she returned to her station. The system wasn't just failing people like Howard, it was actively punishing those who tried to help. Trump pulled out his phone, carefully angling it away from Howard. The text he sent would set in motion a chain of events that would reach far beyond this single bank branch. But for now, he had to maintain his cover. There was more to learn, and what he discovered in the next few minutes would shock even him. Trump noticed a subtle shift in the bank's atmosphere. What had started as a quiet morning had transformed into something charged with tension. More employees were stealing glances at Howard, at Jessica's dejected form at her desk, at the growing line of customers who sensed something unusual was unfolding. He checked his phone discreetly. The pieces were falling into place behind the scenes, but he needed 15 more minutes. 15 minutes to understand just how deep this problem went. "Mr. Mitchell," Trump said gently, "how many times have you tried to access this account?" Howard's weathered hands twisted the edge of his jacket. 7 times now. Different branches, too. Each one has their own reason why they can't help. He pulled out a small notebook where he'd documented each attempt. "First, they said I needed the death certificate, then the marriage license, then proof of residence from when we opened the account. Now, this signature card." His voice trailed off. Trump studied the notebook. In Howard's shaky handwriting was a detailed log of his banking odyssey. Dates, times, names of employees, different requirements at different branches. It painted a picture of a system designed to protect itself rather than serve its customers. A commotion at the front desk drew their attention. An elderly woman was struggling with the electronic signature pad, her arthritic fingers unable to produce a signature that matched her ID. The line behind her grew restless. "I've been banking here for 30 years, she protested, her voice wavering. "Why isn't the regular pad working anymore?" Trump watched as frustration rippled through the queue. A businessman checking his watch, a mother trying to quiet her children, a student scrolling mindlessly on her phone, all caught in a system that had forgotten its purpose was to serve people, not processes. He turned back to Howard, who was watching the scene with sad recognition. "My Sarah," Howard said softly. "She always said banking was about trust. When we opened our account, Mr. Jenkins, he was the manager back then, knew every customer by name. He came to our wedding, you know, different times." The supervisor who had reprimanded Jessica emerged from her office, phone pressed to her ear. Her expression had shifted from stern to concerned as she listened to whoever was on the other end. She kept glancing at her computer screen, then at Howard, then back at her screen. Trump's phone vibrated. The message was simple. Everything is ready. What he was about to do would risk exposing his identity, but the past hour had shown him something crucial. This wasn't just about Howard anymore. It was about every elderly American who'd been left behind by a modernizing world, about every Jessica who wanted to help but couldn't, about every reminder that humanity should matter more than policy. He stood slowly, his disguise suddenly feeling heavier than ever. The next few minutes would transform not just this bank, but banking institutions across America. And it all started with 4 simple words. "I can fix this." The supervisor's phone call ended abruptly as Trump's words cut through the bank's ambient noise. Every head turned toward the elderly man who, until now, had seemed just another victim of the system. "What do you mean, you can fix this?" Howard asked, hope and skepticism warring in his voice. Trump straightened slightly, careful to maintain his elderly demeanor, but letting just enough authority seep into his posture. "Miss Martinez," he called to Jessica, who looked up startled, "would you please pull up Section 4, 18.3 of the banking code on your computer?" The supervisor started forward. "Sir, I must ask you to—" "And," Trump continued calmly, "while you're at it, bring up Federal Regulation 16.7 regarding emergency access protocols for joint accounts following spousal death. His voice carried the weight of decades of business experience, though his appearance remained that of a shabby, elderly man. The bank fell silent. Even the customers in line stopped checking their phones, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Jessica's fingers flew across her keyboard, her supervisor hovering uncertainly nearby. "There's also," Trump added, turning to face the supervisor directly, "a little-known provision passed in 2019 that specifically addresses documentation lost in historical disasters. The Manhattan Bank fire of 1878 is actually listed as one of the qualifying events." Howard stared at Trump, his mouth slightly open. The supervisor's face had drained of color as her computer screen confirmed everything this mysterious elderly man was saying. "But that's not the real problem here, is it?" Trump continued, his voice growing stronger. "The problem is that we've created a banking system that values paperwork over people, where someone like Mr. Mitchell has to visit 7 different branches, each with different requirements, none of them designed to actually help him." He reached into his worn jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the notes he'd been taking throughout the morning. "In the past hour, I've witnessed 4 elderly customers struggle with electronic signature pads. I've seen 3 people unable to read the fine print on your forms, and I've watched 1 dedicated employee get reprimanded for trying to help someone in need." The supervisor's phone rang again. She answered it, her hand shaking slightly. The look on her face as she listened suggested that someone very important was on the other end. "Yes, sir," she said repeatedly, her eyes darting between Trump and her screen. "Yes, he's here right now. Yes, I understand." Trump knew what was happening behind the scenes. His earlier text had set things in motion at the highest levels, but he wasn't done yet. What he was about to reveal would ensure that no one like Howard would ever have to face this struggle again. The supervisor lowered her phone slowly, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Sir, I've just been instructed to give Mr. Mitchell full access to his account immediately." "That's a start," Trump replied, his voice gentle but firm. "But it's not enough." He turned to address the entire bank, including the customers who had abandoned any pretense of conducting their own business in favor of watching the drama unfold. "Last month," he began, pulling another paper from his jacket, "a study showed that 62% of Americans over 70 struggle with modern banking procedures. That's not just a statistic. That's parents, grandparents, veterans who served our country, teachers who educated generations, people like Mr. Mitchell who worked 43 years as a high school principal, who now can't access his own money because of a signature card from 1975. Jessica had moved closer, her tablet in hand. "Sir, I found 17 similar cases in our branch alone from the past month." "And that's just one branch," Trump continued. "Multiply that across every bank in every city. We're not just failing our elderly citizens, we're failing our own future. Because one day, everyone in this room will be Mr. Mitchell." If you're enjoying this story so far, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. It costs you nothing, but for us, especially in these early days, it means the world. Let's continue with what happens next. He walked slowly to the center of the bank floor, his disguise still intact but his presence now commanding the room. The banking system needs to serve people, not the other way around. When did we decide that protecting ourselves from liability was more important than protecting our customers' dignity? The front doors opened, and 2 men in suits entered quietly, taking positions near the wall. Trump knew who they were, his advance team, making sure everything was in place for what came next. "Mr. Mitchell," Trump said, turning back to Howard, "your struggle ends today, not just yours, but everyone who's faced this same battle." He reached into his pocket one final time, removing what looked like an ordinary business card. "This is going to change everything." The supervisor's phone rang again. As she answered it, her eyes widened. "Yes, Mr. President," she stammered. "Yes, he's still here." A murmur rippled through the bank. "President?" Some customers began looking around frantically, trying to spot who might have warranted such a call. "What I'm about to show you," Trump continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "is going to transform banking as we know it. But first—" He paused, his hand moving toward his face. "I think it's time for some honesty." The revelation that followed would not only expose his true identity, but would unveil a revolutionary new banking system that would make headlines across the nation. But more importantly, it would restore hope to millions of Americans who had been left behind by an industry that had forgotten its most fundamental purpose: serving people. With practiced care, Trump began removing his disguise. First, the gray wig came away, then the prosthetic elements that had aged his features. The bank fell silent as realization dawned on every face. Even Howard, who had been sitting next to him for the past hour, took a stumbling step backward. "I'm Donald Trump," he announced, his natural voice returning. "And what I've witnessed today isn't just one man's struggle. It's a national crisis that ends now." Phones came out instantly, recording the moment. The security guards who had entered earlier moved to control the growing excitement in the lobby. 3 hours ago," Trump continued, holding up the business card he'd shown earlier, "I signed an executive order creating the Senior Banking Protection Act. This isn't just another regulation. It's a complete overhaul of how banks serve our elderly citizens." He turned to Howard, whose shock had given way to tears. "Mr. Mitchell, your case isn't unique. It's happening thousands of times every day across America. But because of you, because of what I witnessed here, we're implementing immediate changes." Trump gestured to Jessica, who had been frantically reading something on her tablet. "Miss Martinez, would you like to share what just appeared in your inbox?" Jessica looked up, her eyes wide. It's a new protocol for elderly banking services. Simplified documentation requirements, mandatory in-person assistance options, larger print forms." She scrolled further, her voice growing excited. "And a special provision for cases involving lost documentation due to historical events." "But that's just the beginning," Trump announced. He pulled out his phone, showing a simple app interface. "This is the Senior Banking Shield. Starting next month, every bank in America will be required to provide this service. It's a single, unified system that works across all banks, designed specifically for seniors." He demonstrated the app's features: large, clear buttons, voice commands, fingerprint verification that eliminated the need for complex passwords. "And for those who aren't comfortable with technology, every branch will now have dedicated senior service representatives trained specifically to assist our elderly customers." The supervisor's phone rang one final time. As she listened, her face transformed from concern to understanding. She walked over to Howard, holding out a set of forms in large, clear print. "Mr. Mitchell," she said softly, "we can help you access your account right now, and I owe you an apology. We all do." Howard's hands trembled as he looked at the simple, straightforward forms. "Just like that?" he whispered. "After all these weeks?" "Just like that," Trump confirmed. "Because this is how banking should work. This is how we treat people who built this country." The impact of the moment resonated through the bank. Customers who had been impatiently waiting in line were now wiping tears from their eyes. Jessica beamed with vindication. Even the security guards seemed moved by the transformation they were witnessing. But what happened next would prove that this was more than just a political moment. It was the beginning of a revolution in American banking that would touch millions of lives. The energy in the bank shifted as phones started ringing throughout the building. Other branches were calling, their managers having just received the same directive. News vans began appearing outside, their satellite dishes rising into the morning sky as word spread about what was unfolding inside First Capital Bank. Howard sat at Jessica's desk, watching in amazement as she processed his paperwork with the new simplified system. His hands, which had trembled with anxiety all morning, now rested calmly in his lap. "Sarah would have loved this," he said softly. "She always said banking should be about helping people, not hurting them." Trump moved through the bank, now fully himself, talking with other elderly customers who had been struggling with their own banking challenges. Each story reinforced the importance of what he'd just set in motion. "Sir," the supervisor called, her voice carrying a new note of respect, "we're receiving reports from other branches. They're already implementing the new protocols. The response—" She paused, emotion catching in her throat. "It's overwhelming." A large screen behind the teller windows flickered to life, showing news coverage beginning to break across the country. The headline scrolled, "Breaking: Trump's undercover mission sparks banking revolution." But the most powerful moment was yet to come. An elderly woman pushed through the gathering crowd outside, making her way into the bank with determination. Her hands clutched a familiar-looking set of papers, the same type Howard had been carrying. As she saw Trump, recognition dawned on her face. "Are you really fixing this?" she asked, her voice quavering. "My husband. He's been trying for months. After serving 40 years as a teacher, he can't even access his pension because of all the red tape." Trump took her papers gently. "Not anymore, ma'am. In fact—" He turned to address the growing crowd inside the bank, including the news cameras that had begun streaming in. "What you're about to see is going to change everything." He pulled out his phone again, but this time he wasn't just demonstrating the app. What he revealed next would bring the entire bank to tears and become a symbol of hope for elderly Americans nationwide. Trump held up his phone, its screen projected onto the bank's large display. "This isn't just about making banking easier," he announced. "It's about restoring dignity to millions of Americans." The screen showed a live feed of banks across the country, all receiving the same update simultaneously. In New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, every bank in America is installing this system right now, he continued. "But watch this." He nodded to Howard. "Mr. Mitchell, would you mind standing up?" Howard rose slowly, confusion evident on his face. Trump tapped his phone and the screen split into dozens of smaller windows. In each one, another elderly person stood in another bank, their stories mirroring Howard's. "Ladies and gentlemen," Trump's voice filled the hushed bank, "meet the faces of our banking crisis. Veterans, teachers, nurses, factory workers, Americans who built this country. Each one has been fighting the same battle Mr. Mitchell faced. And today, all of their struggles end together." Jessica gasped as her computer screen lit up with a new notification. "The accounts," she exclaimed, "they're all being unlocked simultaneously. The new system is clearing them automatically." The elderly woman who had just entered began to cry as she watched her own account status change on Jessica's screen. "My Robert," she whispered. "He can finally access his pension." But Trump wasn't finished. He turned to Howard, his expression softening. "Mr. Mitchell, there's something else you should know. While investigating your case, we discovered something remarkable about your late wife, Sarah." The room fell silent, every eye fixed on Trump as he revealed a truth that would transform this banking revolution into something far more personal and profound. "Sarah Mitchell," Trump began, pulling up an old newspaper clipping on the large screen, "wasn't just a customer at this bank. In 1975, she was one of the first female bank tellers in Manhattan, and more than that—" He paused as the image changed to a yellowed document. "She wrote a proposal, never implemented, about making banking accessible for elderly customers." Howard's legs wobbled. Jessica quickly brought him a chair as Trump continued. "Your wife saw this problem coming decades ago," Trump said softly. "She understood that as banking became more complex, more automated, we risked leaving behind the very people who built our financial system." The screen filled with Sarah's handwritten notes, her elegant script outlining concerns that had become reality. Electronic systems excluding elderly users, complex documentation requirements, the loss of personal banking relationships. "What we're implementing today," Trump revealed, his voice thick with emotion, "is based on the framework your Sarah designed 45 years ago. She called it Banking with Dignity." Howard covered his face with trembling hands. "She never told me," he whispered. She was always taking notes, always saying things could be better, but I never knew. The supervisor stepped forward, holding a framed photograph that had been hanging in the bank's back office. It showed a group of bank employees from 1975 with Sarah Mitchell standing proudly in the front row. "Your wife's picture has been on our wall all this time," she said, her professional demeanor cracking. "We walked past it every day, never connecting that the young woman who wanted to revolutionize banking was the same person whose husband we'd been turning away." But what Trump pulled from his pocket next would prove that Sarah Mitchell's legacy was about to transform not just one bank, not just one city, but the entire American banking system. Trump retrieved an elegant blue folder from his jacket. "Mr. Mitchell," he said, turning to Howard, "this executive order doesn't just change banking procedures, it establishes the Sarah Mitchell Banking Access Act." The room collectively gasped. Howard's eyes filled with fresh tears as Trump continued. "Every bank in America will now be required to have a Sarah Mitchell Center, a dedicated space with trained professionals helping elderly customers navigate their finances with dignity. Your wife's vision isn't just being implemented, it's becoming federal law." On the large screen, images began appearing from banks across the country. Spaces were already being transformed, signs being printed, staff being trained. The banking revolution wasn't coming, it was happening right now. "But there's more," Trump said, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent bank. He nodded to someone at the door, and a group of elderly individuals entered. Former colleagues of Sarah's from 1975, each carrying their own stories of how she had helped them understand the importance of accessible banking. "Your Sarah didn't just write proposals," one woman said, stepping forward. "She spent her lunch hours helping elderly customers fill out forms. She'd visit nursing homes on weekends to help residents with their banking questions. She knew that money wasn't just about numbers, it was about independence, dignity, and respect." The supervisor's phone buzzed one final time. As she read the message, tears sprang to her eyes. "Sir," she said to Trump, "every major bank in the country has just signed on. They're all implementing the Sarah Mitchell protocols immediately. No delays, no phase-in period. It's happening today." Howard stood slowly, supported by Jessica. "My Sarah," he whispered, looking at his wife's young face in the old photograph. "She did all this?" "No, Mr. Mitchell," Trump replied, placing a hand on his shoulder. "She started it. We're just finally catching up to her wisdom. And now—" He turned toward the bank's entrance, where something was about to happen that would turn this moment of transformation into a symbol of hope for generations to come. The Sarah Mitchell Banking Access Act transformed American banking overnight. Within weeks, every major bank in the country had established its Sarah Mitchell Center, each one displaying her photograph and the principles she had written so many years ago. Howard Mitchell became a regular visitor at his local branch, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He would sit in the comfortable chairs of the Sarah Mitchell Center, sharing stories about his wife with elderly customers who came seeking help. His presence turned a simple banking space into something more, a community where dignity and respect weren't just policies, but lived values. Jessica Martinez was promoted to head the first Sarah Mitchell Center training program, teaching other bankers nationwide how to serve elderly customers with compassion and understanding. The supervisor who had once turned Howard away became one of the program's strongest advocates, often sharing the story of how a former president's undercover mission had opened her eyes. Trump's experiment sparked a wider conversation about how society treats its elderly citizens. Other industries began examining their own practices, asking themselves the same question that had driven Sarah Mitchell to write her proposal in 1975. Are we serving all our people, or just the ones who can navigate our systems? 1 month after his undercover visit, Trump returned to First Capital Bank, this time as himself. He found Howard sitting in the Sarah Mitchell Center, helping another elderly couple understand their banking options. The scene perfectly captured what Sarah had envisioned, a banking system that didn't just process transactions, but honored the dignity of every customer. "You know," Howard said to Trump that day, Sarah used to say that kindness was the best investment anyone could make. I think she would have been proud to see her name on these walls, but even prouder to see what happens inside them every day. As Howard's words spread through social media and news reports, they became a rallying cry for a new era of American banking, one where humanity and dignity weren't just marketing slogans, but the foundation of every transaction. Sarah Mitchell's legacy lived on, not just in the centers bearing her name, but in the countless elderly Americans who could now manage their finances with independence and pride. Her simple dream of making banking accessible to everyone had finally become reality, proving that sometimes the greatest changes start with one person caring enough to say, "There must be a better way." Sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with a simple act of kindness. Sarah believed in a world where dignity was a right, not a privilege. And today, her vision reminds us that change is possible when we choose to care. What legacy will you leave behind?